Welcome to the OECD webinar on building systemic climate resilience in cities. My name is Tadashi Matsumoto, Head of Unit Sustainable Development and Global Relations at the Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division at the OECD. Welcome again, all the panelists, speakers, and all the audiences. As people are joining, I would like to give a few housekeeping information. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be added to our website after the webinar. The language of today is English. No interpretation will be provided. This is a Zoom webinar setting, and you can use the chat function to contact our support team for any technical difficulty you may experience. We invite all of you to use the Q&A function to share your thought and to ask your questions to panelists. When you ask questions, please make sure to specify who your questions addressed, directed to. Welcome again. I'm seeing if everything going well. If seems okay. Now, I would like to start the webinar by welcoming Sujin Kim, Acting Head of Division of Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development, OECD, to give opening remarks. Sujin, welcome, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tadashi, and hello, welcome to all. Once again, the beauty of Zoom is bringing together people from all over the planet. So we have, I guess, some early birds in the Americas. We have late night owls in the Asia Pacific region, and I guess some hungry crowds here in Europe where it's kind of lunchtime. So thank you all for joining. This workshop is organized by the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. And it's part of a broader OECD horizontal project, which is called Building Climate and Economic Resilience in the Transition to a Low Carbon Economy. So it's a project that draws on expertise from across the organization, and notably from the Environment Directorate and also the Development Cooperation Directorate. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank warmly my colleagues from these two directorates as well. So now to frame today's discussion, which is entitled Building Systemic Climate Resilience in Cities, I just wanted to highlight briefly 3 points, which are very simple, around why, what, and who. So the first point is about why and why this urgent need to build climate resilience. And of course, it's a no-brainer, and sadly, but every day that passes, we see or hear another manifestation of devastating consequences of climate change. And perhaps one of the most recent events was it 3 days ago, when the collapse of a glacier in the Italian Alps has killed at least 7 people. And even though at COP26 in Glasgow, you know, all of our countries have reaffirmed their commitment to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And even if all the pledges that have been announced there were fully implemented in time, we know that the world is still headed to a warming of at least 2.1 degrees by the end of this century, which means we will miss the goal of the Paris Agreement, and this is paving the way for more disaster globally, of course. But one of the reasons why we are struggling so much to meet these targets is, I think, my second point, the what of climate resilience. We actually don't simply need to build climate resilience. We need systemic climate resilience because there are complex interdependencies between climate and other economic, social, health outcomes, and vice versa. So for example, when you think of heat waves, as an illustration, heat waves are not just a climate phenomenon. They also have tremendous economic consequences because according to a report by the ILO, for example, heat waves are projected to reduce working hours globally by 2.2% by 2030. And it represents a huge economic loss, obviously. When you think of air pollution, for example, it also causes or aggravates respiratory diseases, which we now know are associated with high risks of developing serious forms of diseases such as COVID-19. Or more recently, the war in Ukraine has caused a huge rise in gas prices and is really reinforcing the need to accelerate the transition to renewable and more sustainable energy. So you see all these complex cascading effects show that it is absolutely essential to adopt this systems approach and to understand both the direct and the indirect interrelations across the different spheres, and to take action on several fronts at the same time. So this is exactly why the OECD has developed this horizontal project that builds on multidisciplinary expertise from across the organization. Now, today's workshop is really focusing on the role of cities in building systemic climate resilience. And this brings me to my third and final point, which was for the WHO. As recognized in the recent report from the IPCC, Climate Change 2022, cities are both part of the problem and part of the solution to climate shocks. So obviously, first part of the problem, because cities will soon concentrate more than half of the world's population. So they are the biggest consumers, the biggest polluters and wasters, if I may say so. We also know that, for example, 1 in 5 people living in cities is already exposed to a large-scale flood, and this represents a huge global loss of around $52 billion by 2050. So, of course, cities are a big part of the problem. But cities can also be places of opportunities and solutions if they take the right actions with the right tools. And cities actually have a key responsibility in many of the policies that are critical to climate action, such as land use planning, zoning, water and waste management, sanitation, housing, transport, and many others. And when you look at the data across the OECD, in the countries where we do have comparable data, local and regional governments account for 63% of climate significant public expenditure and for 69% of climate significant public investment. So they can be key actors in this fight against climate change. And this is why cities need to work with national governments to respond to the complexity of climate challenges. No level of government alone will be able to rise to the challenge. And this is why the OECD is helping both countries and cities to take this collaborative climate action through our OECD program called a territorial approach to climate action and resilience. So to close with this why, the what, and the who in mind, I'm sure you're all eager to jump into today's discussion of the key drivers that can help strengthen the systemic resilience of our cities. We will zoom actually into 4 key drivers across the 3 sessions of today's workshop, as my colleague Tadashi will enlighten us in a minute. The outcomes of today's workshop will feed into a paper that we are currently preparing and we will be launching at COP27, which will take place in November. So I very much look forward to hearing from the stellar lineup of speakers who have kindly accepted to share their insights with us today. We have a very nice mix of academia, national and subnational governments, city networks, practitioners from different spheres. So I'm sure today's discussion will be a very inspiring discussion for all of us, and it will encourage us to take further action. So thank you all again for joining, and I'm giving the floor back over to you, Tadashi. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujin, for very comprehensive opening remarks. And I would like to continue a short presentation to set the scene, particularly focusing on why this is already Sujin mentioned, but why cities are a key for transforming and building systemic resilience, climate resilience. I'd like to start with the first slide, which you can go to the next slide, Dunya, thank you. To explain briefly outline the OECD horizontal project, building climate and economic resilience in the transition of a low carbon economy. This OECD flagship project aims to ensure that an effective response to climate change is and should be at the heart of government efforts to improve economic and societal resilience after COVID-19. Particularly, project was initiated in 2020 and being carried out in over 2021 and 22. The key argument here is that as climate risk rise, recognizing that climate cut across all policy areas, it requires system thinking and better understanding of this nonlinear effects and then tipping points and all the comprehensive understanding of how climate change affects different social and economic systems. We are doing this exercise as a key part of OECD-wide approach to climate, drawing on OECD's full multidisciplinarity. In our management, OECD Environment Directorate and the Environment Policy Committee leads the project with a key contribution across 11 directorate and 13 OECD committees on board. The project aims to develop comprehensive and concrete policy recommendations across 4 modules. The first module is looking at reframing the climate challenge after COVID-19. Second module is focusing on mitigation, accelerating the transition to net zero emissions. And the third module, building systemic resilience to climate impacts, to which this workshop is directly contributing to. And then the fourth module is international program for action and action on climate. We call it IPAC, which is a project to track progress towards climate goals. Next slide. Now we try to apply this systemic resilience concept into cities and then try to understand how cities can apply this concept. The first thing we like to think is really to reframe or rethink the impacts of climate change. The next slide is showing some summary of what we see as an interaction between climate and climate shocks and then other systems. So on the left-hand side, as you see, climate shocks affects multiple systems in cities. Sujin already gave a few examples, but here, as you see, climate shocks from fast onset events like floods and storms to slower onset events like biodiversity loss or sea level rise has a direct impact, particularly damage to an urban asset or urban infrastructure. However, we are witnessing more and more complex and cascading compounded or indirect impacts. Talking about supply chains, manufacturing, production disruption, decrease in labor productivity, increased food prices, and so on. Also, this is quite important to highlight that these impacts are not at the same level in places and across people. So in particular, increased vulnerability of economically and socially marginalized communities based on due to this climate impact needs to be really taken into account when we talk about shocks. On the right-hand side, arrows are also showing that it's another dimension, meaning that actually other shocks, many other shocks coming from other systems are in fact affecting climate action as well. As you see, for example, this is a COVID-19 example, but COVID-19 pandemic, you can also discuss the war in Ukraine also, but these global shocks have been causing profound impact, of course, economic and social hardship, but also on climate through different financing flows, the fiscal austerity in local governments, also changing location preference of people and firms, all the different phenomena affected by other world global shocks are affecting climate change, and these shocks and impacts also needs to be taken into account when we are talking about climate risks. So overall, the slide is showing that we need to rethink and more directly, we need a little more comprehensive understanding of climate shocks and risks, considering different systems. Next slide is now showing how to solve it, how to address this question of systemic approach. What does it really mean in cities, in the context of cities? We have been doing some desk research and also dialogues with OECD member countries and cities, and come up with a few ideas, preliminary ideas. The first slide I'd like to show is at least four key elements of systemic resilience. And we, of course, like to hear more from the participant of today. But at least we see these four as an indispensable element of systemic resilience. First, as already mentioned, the better understanding of complex climate risks in cities. Second, addressing asymmetric impacts across people and places. Third, synergies and co-benefits with other systems in cities in implementing climate action. Then the number four is coordination and engagement across diverse actors. With these four as a key element, we are also trying to understand what would be really the concrete actions or policy approaches, which we are also identifying in the next slide, showing six, at least we identify 6 approaches here. again, we like to hear more from distinguished panelists and participants if these are right direction for us to support countries and cities. So I'm not going to read all of this, but you will see, different directions and also linked with derived from the 4 pillars that I explained. And actually, the 3 sessions that we are going to have from now on is around these specific policy approaches. So we hope that many of the panelists are addressing and providing guidance to these policy approaches. Now, I think this was the final slide. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank again for all the panelists who are attending. And as Sujin mentioned, we like to use your inputs, all the inputs in this workshop to develop our paper, which we can try to disseminate in COP27 and widely to policymakers. So thank you very much. Now, I would like to start the session 1. I would like to introduce Catherine Kemper, coordinator of the OECD Task Force on Climate Change Adaptation, OECD Environment Directorate. Catherine, welcome. Thank you for taking this moderator role. Floor is yours.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Tadashi, and welcome everyone on the panel, and welcome all the participants to this exciting seminar today. So as Tadashi says, my background is from the OECD's climate change, OECD Environment Directorate, and more specifically, I'm leading the OECD's work on climate change adaptation, which has grown tremendously in the last few years. And we collaborate with our colleagues from CFE because cities are obviously also at the heart of the things that we worry about, even if we work with national policymakers over where we work. But the questions that Tadashi is asking our distinguished panelists to talk about are very important questions, because climate impacts are not sort of easily projectable impacts that we can sort of downscale at the city level, but they often bring with them a very complex set of cascading risks that we have difficulties in understanding, difficulties in predicting, given the massive amount of uncertainties and given the non-linearity that we see in those impacts. So even if by sort of looking in the past, we understand some sort of knock-on impacts of a climate extreme event or of climate variability through trickling through supply chains locally or internationally, it is not a good predictor of what may or may not be happening in the future. So we need sort of people that help us get our head around these complex risks and help us get a systemic understanding of what these cascading impacts could really mean and what they could mean for cities. So I would like to ask our panelists to help us reflect not only on the risks that could potentially emanate within cities and that may, as Tadashi says, have different distributional impacts within cities, but also perhaps think about how cities can be affected of risks emanating outside of their sort of territory, geographically speaking or economically speaking, which is something that, if you look at the EU adaptation strategy, recently is very, very concerned about. So they highlight the priority of needing to understand climate risks emanating outside of the EU territory to understand how this affects society and economy within the EU as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the 3 of you, and then from Paolo as well, who will discuss and share a few insights from the work of CFE, reflecting on the points that we will discuss today. And with that, I think without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first presenter, Mark Pelling, who's a professor of geography at King's College, and who will hopefully help us understand how we can adapt or how we can adjust sort of the way we go about conducting climate risk assessment to take account of these sort of complex cascading effects that we're interested in today. Over to you, Mark, for the first presentation.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and it's a real pleasure to talk to everybody today. If I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. So I thought whilst I introduce the four themes of this talk, it's worth always starting from a view from the ground, from the city. So you have on this slide, and I'll let you read it, but it's a cartoon taken from the Guyana Chronicle from 1996 that certainly, even in those days, illustrates what it is to live with compounding and cascading risk. There are four things I want to do in the next 8 minutes or so. The first is to just underline the opportunity that Tadashi presented to us, indeed a responsibility that urbanization offers as a time-limited space within which we can address resilience in inclusive and sustainable ways. And then to say a few things about the shape of this challenge. How is it that not just climate change, but processes of urbanization are generating patterns of changing risk? And again, some of that has been alluded to in terms of the not just cascades that are within cities, but also across cities into the global space and also into the rural space. To say a few words about how well we've been doing to date, what are some of the trajectories in adaptation policy and action? Are they responding to this changing co-generation of risk in cities? And then finally, to offer one evaluation meta frame, if you will, that comes from some of the debates on climate resilient development. And a lot of the material that I'm going to show to you draws from the IPCC Working Group 2 Sixth Assessment Report chapter on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure. So by all means, look there for additional information or contact me. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So you're all very familiar with the rapid urbanization that we've been experiencing and that this is projected to go through into the future. I think it's important, often in climate change, we think about the future risk, future policy, how we can respond to this future. But urban expansion, rapid urban expansion, going beyond the capabilities of governments and the private sector, as well as community actors to provide basic infrastructure, is now. So we're building on a trajectory which is both shaping risk, but of course, in so doing, also providing us with a time-limited opportunity. So now into the next 10, 20 years is that opportunity where cities become a key place of global significance for addressing climate change and all of those other interconnected risks that will determine the vulnerabilities and capacities of individuals exposed to climate risk. Here are some of the facts, but you'll be familiar with them. Not just has there been a growth of 397 million people between 2015 and 2020, but 90% of that growth is in less developed regions. So we start to get a sense of where to prioritize. Unplanned and informal settlements in low and middle income nations and smaller and medium-sized urban centres, so centres of about 1 million and less, are the places where most rapid growth is expected and has been experienced. And of course, it's exactly in these places where we know that vulnerability is high and capacity is constrained. And I would say that reaches into science as well. So very much the science knowledge that we have tends to draw from larger cities and from more formal urban planned contexts. Looking forward, by 2050, there is a projected 2.5 billion extra people who'll be living in urban areas, with up to 90% of this increase in Asia and Africa. So that expansion we've experienced continuing through in Asia and Africa. And more than 1 billion people located in low-lying cities and settlements expected to be at risk from coastal specific hazards. In trying to review the literature for the AR6, in a way that could give a global view. It was very hard to do that for anything other than sea level rise related hazards. So for the particular period of science that we were reviewing, there wasn't a comprehensive study, even on heat, let alone some of the more dispersed hazards. So there really is, again, a data challenge for us being able to understand the shape of risk and vulnerability going forwards. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we accept that there is a responsibility and opportunity for us to work on cities with global consequences as well as local, what's the shape of the challenge? I think we know some of this quite well. So certainly not just from climate change work, but from disaster risk reduction work from the 1980s in particular onwards, when there's been a decent global data resource. We're well attuned to some of the direct impacts and hazards associated with hydrometeorological risks. And as was outlined in some of those introductory comments, now we also recognize cascading effects, and that many of these cascading effects and the direct hazards associated with climate change can be compounding. So the same people may be affected by the direct hazards associated with climate change, the cascading impacts that may come through things like supply chains, as well as being exposed to non-climate risks like pandemic. Importantly, in AR6, we're able to show that these sorts of effects are observed. So again, these are happening now. This isn't a conversation about preparing for the future alone. It is that, but it's about preparing and responding to current risks for which there is a significant gap. So what are the implications for urban adaptation priorities in this environment where risk is being generated by urbanization as much as by climate change? And there are three implications that I've kind of offer here. First is an opportunity to address compound hazard and think about co-benefits. Air quality is a great example where there are co-benefits that extend beyond climate change into the way in which we particularly manage transport and other activities in cities to enhance air quality that will, alongside work on heat, reduce the consequences of high temperatures in cities. So we can think about compound hazard. We can also think about compound risk, where vulnerabilities overlap and co-benefits for wider development challenges. Places like informal settlements then may become a priority. And finally, perhaps most challengingly, to think about moving from the adaptation of objects like dwellings to a particular flood scenario towards programming adaptation of systems, health systems, livelihood systems. So there are objects embedded here, but there are also processes of decision making. There are people, there are the safety of employees, there's the safety of customers or patients. So it's a very different way of thinking about how do we measure, how do we plan for adaptation. And there are three examples then of adapting across systems, connecting different systems together across sectors or jurisdictions. Supply chains has been mentioned already, but this really shifts us not just broadly from an urban to an urban-rural focus, but makes us ask questions about producers, about speculators and commodity speculators in global commodity chains, about distribution, about retailing, and about the consumer behavior. All of these sites become places of adaptation. There are priority interventions as well to be made in interconnected infrastructure across cities. So we understand that cities essentially are interconnected infrastructure networks, energy, transport, trade, work are connected. And this maybe directs us towards some of the front-end infrastructures. And if we can make those secure through adaptation, perhaps some of the cascading risk can be missed out. And finally, to buffer, adaptation to buffer from multi-risk shocks. And this is the message that comes from COVID-19, where some of the tenets of sustainable urbanization, for example, the advantages that come from interconnected, highly interconnected places and high density settlements have been challenged. So not to throw these advantages out, but to really think about how is it that infrastructure decision-making can enable interconnected places that can be secure from pandemic, high density, that can provide the infrastructures that are needed for well-being. So if I can move to the next slide, please. I'll move through this quickly, but there are some key messages around how far the evidence suggests we are fit to take up these challenges. An important finding from the AR6 since AR5 is that whilst we have many plans for adaptation in cities, many of these plans are not implemented. So we are rich in plans, we are poor in implementation. There are an increasing array of adaptation options available to us. Of course, physical infrastructure is at the front, but we have a lot of work now being taken up around ecosystem-based adaptation, slower uptake of social policy options, not just insurance, but thinking about social protection, decision-making, education, healthcare. So there's a whole world of possible options there that are not yet being taken up, let alone hybrid experiments where there is a blending between the physical ecosystem and social policy. And even further down the line, any kind of assessment of effectiveness or the consequences of those different options. We recognize interconnected infrastructure, and that's been mentioned a couple of times now. But again, there's very little comparative evaluation of how to adapt these interconnected infrastructures. The same can be said of intersectional and gender responsive vulnerability reduction. There's an awful lot of local work. There's much less work on the mechanisms for upscaling and for collaboration between government and local actors. And the similar could be said about more inclusive processes of bringing adaptation into this sort of more programmatic vision of adaptation that requires participatory planning, local knowledge to be embedded. So if I can move to the penultimate slide, please. Thank you. Climate resilient development then is one framework which might help to give us some guidance as we start thinking through these much more complex ways in which adaptation can be planned and deployed. Climate resilient development is an idea which is being debated in the literature. For most, it means bringing together the goals of adaptation, of climate mitigation and sustainable development. Some work we did in the city settlements and key infrastructure chapter also included risk management as an aspect, slightly different from adaptation. You can't read the table, but you can look at the colors. This brings together 21 different adaptation actions, so very broad categories along the horizontal axis, and 17 different components of climate resilient development. And some of the key messages are, well, there's limited systemic evidence gathering across any of this. We managed to review 750 papers, but as you can imagine, we had to dig deep into a lot of those papers to draw out conclusions. But there's clearly a lot of scope for co-benefits between this array of adaptation approaches and the different elements of climate resilient development. So there's lots of opportunity, although we're flying a little bit blind at the moment. No single adaptation option was successful across all of the climate resilient development categories. So we cannot rely on a single action, which points us again towards programmatic, towards integrated planning for adaptation, action for adaptation. Urban planning, though, did tick more boxes than any other category. So that is a priority for integration. Physical infrastructure, as you might expect, did many things very well, but did constrain future options. Shifting exposure, shifting risk as a consequence of adaptation was the greatest unmet challenge. So this is the fourth column in from the left, and you can see pretty much everything is red or white. So pretty much all adaptation options were unable to say that they had prevented risk from shifting from one place or group of people to another. So that would be a key challenge. The high level summary, integrated adaptation planning is really at the heart of this, based on evidence of evaluation. If I could have the final slide, please. Just to conclude then, urbanization indeed as a global opportunity, I would say responsibility for inclusive resilience. There is a question, can adaptation keep up with risk and impact trends? And I presented some texture on that. It's a fantastically exciting time, I think, to be modulating the way in which adaptation is deployed. There are indeed multiple adaptation knowledge gaps, particularly around evaluating the consequences of adaptation actions in these new diverse contexts. And climate resilient development perhaps offers us with one overarching framework through which we can judge not just effectiveness of adaptation as a project level, but at a broader contribution towards sustainable development. So thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a very, very interesting overview and going much beyond sort of the simple risk assessment angle. And thank you very much for all the food for thoughts for our discussion later on. I think we took a little bit more time to speak. If Mauricio and Anna can try to stay within their 8 minutes limit, that would hugely help if we are to take on questions from the audience after our presentations. So with that, may I hand over to Mauricio Rodas, who is now a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as at the Rockefeller Center on Resilience, and former mayor also of Quito in Ecuador. So hopefully we hear sort of key insights into how it is being a mayor, into trying to invest and strengthen resilience at the city level. With this, please, Mauricio, over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to the OECD for this kind invitation. It is really great to be part of this very interesting discussion. So yes, I will try to provide my perspective on this important topic. So if we can go to the next slide, please, and I'll try to stick to the time. You all know this data. We are all city experts. We know how important cities are to tackle climate change and to build resilience to protect the majority of the world's population. So let's just move to the next one, please. We all know what kind of shocks cities are exposed to: droughts, floods, extreme heat, fires, sandstorms, cyclones, hurricanes, so on and so forth. So it is in cities where we need to build resilience, and cities are perfect labs to innovate and to implement new solutions to build resilience. Can we go to the next one, please? This is an interesting slide for me because, as you know, the Global Climate Risk Index and its 16th edition in 2021 provided us with a clear picture of how the situation of the world is going regarding the affection from natural disasters. And a pattern that we can find is that we have every year more and more countries being affected by this kind of climate hazards. Between 2000 and 2019, over 475,000 people lost their lives as a direct result of more than 11,000 extreme weather events. That's what we are talking about here. But this is very useful country data. We don't have city data. So that's one of the problems. We need to develop city-related data when it comes to the impact of natural disasters in cities because of climate change. So probably that's one of the first conclusions that I would like to bring to the table here. Municipalities are very frequently not in a capacity to develop properly developed data on these topics. So that's when international organizations can be very helpful in order for them to come up with such data. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we have an approach of how to deal with multi-dimensional hazards, vulnerabilities, and perceived risks in cities. On the one hand, we have natural features that determine climate shocks, and on the other, we have social features that determine vulnerability and resilience. We know that climate shocks and vulnerabilities vary within each city. I can tell you, for example, what we did here in Quito. We developed a risk atlas for the city, and we identified those areas of the city that, for example, were most prone to risks from floods, from landslides, even from earthquakes. That was very helpful because that it allowed us to develop certain specific policies and actions in those areas to protect the population. But something that we also learn is that at the end of the day, all areas in a city and all segments of the population are in certain level of danger, all of them. And of course, we know that it is the most vulnerable population, the one most at risk. Can we go to the next one, please? Here we have some of the climate shocks in cities. We know that, and we were talking about vulnerable populations, we know that economically deprived populations, the elderly, those people with pre-existing conditions are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate-driven hazards. We also know that since cities concentrate the majority of economic activities, it is their infrastructure also the most at risk. We know that extreme heat, for example, is exacerbated in cities because of the urban heat island effect. We know also that many cities are located in coastal areas, and therefore they are prone to the risk associated with rises in sea level, storm activity, and flooding. And we also know that the more dense a city, the more prone to this kind of dangers are. Can we go to the next one, please? Here we can find all of the potential impacts for cities coming from climate change. We know that health can be impacted. We have food security issues, basic service provision, infrastructure, housing, the economy, etc. Can we go to the next one, please? I would like to focus on a particular issue in which I am working right now, which is extreme heat in cities. Why? Because extreme heat is the #1 climate-driven killer. Heat kills more people than all other climate-driven hazards combined. And we know that it is particularly severe in cities because of what I just mentioned regarding the heat urban island effect. But heat not only affects human health, it also affects the economy. According to a report published by the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center last year, it was estimated $100 billion in economic losses due to reduced workers' productivity in the US in just 1 year, in 2020. That's what we are talking about. We're talking about not only a huge impact for human health and a deadly impact, but also how can heat impact the economy and jobs. And of course, we know that this is a growing trend. It will keep increasing over time because of climate change and rising temperatures. So it is estimated that by 2050, 1 billion people will be directly affected and threatened by lethal heat waves. We've seen how dangerous this can be. Last year, 1,000 people died in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia because of heat waves. We've witnessing what's going on during this summer. It just started, and we have seen how India, Pakistan, Europe have been struggling because of very severe heat waves very early in the summer. And let's see what happens during the next few weeks. And this also affects everyday life. For example, at 40 degrees Celsius, iPhones can be shut off. They cannot work. At 48, almost 49 degrees Celsius, airplanes cannot fly. And we can number a lot of other aspects in which extreme heat is affecting urban dynamic and social everyday life for people. Can we go to the next one, please? And this, as you can see, is a clear example of the need to build systemic resilience, because heat, as a particular example, affects a lot of different aspects of human health, the economy, and social dynamics. You know the definition of resilience. We can go to the next one, please. Here we have an approach of why it is so important to undertake resilience-related measures in a systemic way in cities. Why? Because systemic resilience is the capacity of a system to anticipate, absorb, recover from, and adapt to a wide array of systemic threats.
Mauricio, I don't want to interrupt you, but it would be good if you come to a close in a minute or two.
Yes, I'm going there, don't worry. So the idea is to pursue multiple objectives to address this issue. Can we go to the next one, please? And we can skip this one. We can go to the final one, please. Yeah, let's go to the next one. This is the last one, don't worry. Next one, please. Yes, okay. Again, coming to the extreme heat example. This illustrates why it is so important to address a particular climate-driven hazard in a systemic way to build resilience in cities. In the case of extreme heat, it is important to first develop an institutional framework to come up with an extreme heat policy framework, with heat action plans, to have someone dedicated within the municipal structure to address extreme heat, and to build a multi-stakeholder task force to address this particular issue. So we have first the institutional dimension. Then we have the communications one. It is very important to raise awareness about the threat that extreme heat poses. Many people don't know about the fact that, again, heat is the #1 climate-driven hazard killer. So it is important for the population to understand the risks associated with heat for human health, for the economy, for different industries, for outside workers and jobs, and for the overall social dynamic, like I mentioned before. And there are several instruments by which you can do this. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the Ashrock Center launched in Seville, Spain, the first ever heat wave ranking and naming system. The idea is to name heat waves just like we name hurricanes. And that has proven to be very effective, because when you name a hurricane and you provide it a category, a ranking, according to the level of its severity, people know what to do about it, what levels of protection they have to undertake in order to be safe. So the idea is to do the same with heat waves. And fortunately, there's a system already developed for this. Again, Seville was the first city in the world to launch it a couple of weeks ago. There are some other cities in the US that are also developing the methodology. Athens launched a heat wave categorization system also a couple of weeks ago. So I think this can be a very important communication tool for the population to know how to protect themselves for this particular risk. And then we have...
Mauricio, again, may I remind you, please, so that we have a little bit of time for Anna's presentation as well.
I am finalizing right now.
We can share your slides. I mean, I speak under the control of Tadashi, but I'm very sure we can share your slides and all the good examples you're giving with the audience today.
Sure, thank you. So finally, there are also on-the-ground options that have to do with a lot of things regarding resilience building. One of them is urban gardens. By building urban gardens, which is so easy to do, you are not only undertaking an adaptation measure, you are providing food security for the population, you are addressing poverty alleviation, gender inequality, because most people working on urban gardens are women. So this is the kind of thing, again, that by implementing a holistic approach, a systemic approach, you can build resilience in cities. You can undertake the need to protect the population for increasingly severe climate hazards. Thank you.
Mauricio, thank you so much for your passionate making the case, which is obviously very, very true. Many of the cities are exposed to extreme heat and all the other climate risks you mentioned, and also your points are very well taken of what role international organizations can take to help the purpose. Thank you so much, and hopefully you're still around for questions after our presentations. Again, without further ado, Anna, may I hand over to you for our last presentation today. Anna Brown is the founder and principal of Equita Consulting, and hopefully will give us yet another perspective to how we can better understand these complex climate risks in an urban environment. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Everything's good on sound?
Perfect. We have your sounds, we hear you well.
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, thank you. You can keep us here for a second. Great to be here, thanks so much. So we all know that cities are exposed to multiple complex risks given the concentration of people, assets, and economic activity. Climate change, we have a global pandemic, economic downturn. All of these factors are mitigated by the levels and types of exposure and vulnerability that exist. And I've just highlighted some climate impacts here. We've heard about those already a little bit. And you can just click again, please. Vulnerability and also measures taken to increase resilience exist across multiple scales, from the household and individual level up through municipal and beyond. And you can click again. Factors like those on the right here mediate the level of preparedness and the ability to recover quickly and to adapt. And as we know, cities and their inhabitants aren't homogeneous at all. So a household that's living in the floodplains with a disabled child can navigate risks really differently than a family living on higher ground. Similarly, a community that's living with inadequate housing or lacks adequate sanitation or safe water already struggling to meet basic needs and experiences a higher burden of disease and poor health. So if you add on top of that a heat wave, as we've just heard about, or flood event, the consequences for these kinds of contexts and these kinds of communities can be very dire. And you can flip to the next slide, please. Okay, I think actually we're going, if you can just click us back. I think we were a little bit back. Yeah, sorry, we're talking a bit. We'll talk a bit about Texas for a second. So I wanted to give an example to illustrate systemic risks that affect cities. So keep us here for a sec. So last year, the winter of 2021, there was, going in the opposite direction of heat, there was a cold snap that hit the state of Texas, and including the city of Houston. And their temperatures dropped to -8 degrees Celsius, and this was coupled with a winter storm. For those of you who aren't aware, Houston is not typically exposed to extreme cold, and so most of the homes are really not very well insulated. They're heated with pretty inefficient electric heaters, and so this all resulted in massive power demand that exceeded levels that had ever been anticipated for a winter storm in Texas. And it was compounded by the fact that power equipment in Texas isn't winterized. So equipment at natural power supply facilities, they froze, and this meant that there were shortages in fuel. So in order to maintain the grid, given this massive power supply imbalance of supply and demand, there were extensive blackouts. And I want to just talk a second about Harris County, which is where Houston is located. In Houston, more than 90% of residents lost electrical power, and in some cases it was for multiple days during this extreme cold period. At least 66 people died in Harris County alone, and there are all sorts of knock-on impacts. We know that in a cold climate, water systems are reliant on heating. And so the power outages meant that a lot of pipes froze and they burst, which led to massive water damage. And there have also been some studies that show that there were significant disparities in the extent and the duration of power outages, and in terms of burst pipes and disrupted food access for census tracts with higher numbers of low and moderate income and non-white populations. And this is all, of course, happening during the pandemic. And I wanted to just note that this actually could have been a whole lot worse, which is because during the critical period, the grid actually dropped frequency, which is essentially a red alert for an electrical power system. So had another 4 minutes and 37 seconds passed without increasing the frequency, the entire grid would have collapsed. And had that happened, it would have actually taken weeks or months to get power back for not just Houston, but for basically most of Texas. The graphic on the right here just illustrates how stresses and shocks compound. Many of the Houston families that suffered during the Texas freeze, that suffered the most, they also suffered extensive damage during Hurricane Harvey just a few years earlier. And then there's, of course, the longer history of redlining that has led to racial and economic disparities. Now you can move to the next slide, thanks. So these past few years have really underscored the interplay between structural inequities and risk. Populations on the front lines of the pandemic have also been on the front lines of racial and ethnic injustices and are also bearing the brunt of climate impacts. So this really calls for a more fundamental reframe on how to equip cities and society for the dynamic and disruptive sets of shocks and stresses that abound. So framing these crises to orient more toward deep systemic change does require different orientation. It requires centering people in planning efforts and addressing underlying systemic inequities. And it means also envisioning and activating new communities, new institutions and economies, and all the while ensuring that urban and regional ecosystems are healthy. You can move to the next slide, please. And I want to just very briefly call out 3 domains for action that have the potential to generate pathways for inclusive and resilient cities. The first is mainstream climate risk information into spatial planning and urban infrastructure and delivery. And while doing that, also ensuring that the capacity is built locally. Second is upgrading living conditions in informal settlements and vulnerable communities, drawing upon local knowledge and experience. And third is to recognize that nature-based solutions are an effective way to manage heat and water risks. And just moving to the next slide, and this is my last slide, the Texas example that I mentioned really highlights the consequences of cascading failure. And it reminds us that impacts play out unevenly. So preparing for the impacts of climate change in other crises requires integrated climate-informed urban planning and policymaking, financing, and community mobilization at the grassroots level. It also requires leadership. And you can just click the last click. And it's also going to be navigating a set of tensions. And I just wanted to highlight a few here that I think are going to grow more pronounced in the coming decades, especially as we're not seeing enough progress on mitigating climate greenhouse gas emission production. So the first is that there's both a need for urgent action at scale, and yet also actions that are built on trust and relationships and factor in a range of perspectives. Often urgent responses are transactional and further exacerbate structural inequities. So identifying courses of action that are rooted in relationships and people takes time, but it also can be more enduring over the long run. The second tension is a reminder that preparing for disasters is more cost effective and it saves lives versus paying for recovery later. However, it's often difficult to make the case for upfront capital expenditure to make communities and systems more resilient. And then the third is just a reminder that coordination across sectors and scales is really critical for maximizing our dollars in terms of cost-effective solutions and achieving multiple benefits. But this is also in tension with the need for targeted solutions and trying to be mindful of resource-constrained contexts. So that's the last one for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for shedding yet a light on the other extreme, on another extreme temperature event, on extreme cold events, and for giving sort of a broader overview of how we can achieve a transformative adaptation approach. Thank you so much. It was very inspiring. And with that, may I hand over to our discussant of this session, my colleague Paolo Veneri, who is a Deputy Head of Division and the Head of Statistics and Territorial Analysis at the same directorate as our colleagues Tadashi and Sujin. And he will hopefully tell us a little bit more about the evidence base that these colleagues have been working to put together to shed light on the impacts of climate change at the city level. Paolo, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to all speakers for this very interesting and very concrete section. Actually, because we talk about many different aspects of this resilience and climate risk at city level. My contribution is, as Catherine said, on the measurement side, on the data at the city level, which is what we have been working on since several years. In this case, I want to echo what Mauricio said, so that international organization has an important role, which I agree. First of all, if you want, today in this session, we discussed that to talk about systemic resilience requires identifying key climate risks in each city and assessing their impact and the social and economic vulnerabilities at the city level. This is very challenging. We cannot do that with the general let's say, approaches and data that are available either at the city level directly or, let's say, through the general statistics that each country publishes through their NSOs. So I think international organizations and scientists can have a very important role in this case. Why? Because, I mean, we have, for example, the help of new sources of information like geospatial data that in this case, in this domain, can really help to monitor climate risks at the city level. On the OECD side, let me just flag that, of course, we have a specific focus. Sometimes we have a global focus, and this links also with what Mark was saying, so attention to the countries and the areas of the world that are urbanizing faster, which are priority, because there we can still intervene in a even more efficient way. We at the OECD, we are focused a little bit more, of course, on OECD member countries, places with already very mature urbanization, high share of people already living in cities. In the OECD, it's already only cities, not just urban areas, but only cities already represent more than half of the population if you take metropolitan areas. So if we include the surrounding of cities, we are close to 65 or 70% of population. So these are, let's say, important aspects. So for the OECD, we work a lot first on trying to measure something that is comparable at the cross-country level, and agreeing on what we mean by city, and also then trying to assess some aspects of that are city-specific. For example, I can mention now on climate risks. I can mention a few indicators that we have been working on, and there will be a paper actually forthcoming in a couple of months on city level indicators on heat stress, for example, urban heat island effect, on flood, and yes, on flood, and in a sense also air pollution can be related, or can, let's say, can interact with climate, with the rising temperature, and so that can be related. On the urban heat island effect, for example, it's by construction an indicator and phenomenon which is specific to cities. And even more, for example, what we learned that not only specific to cities, but it tends to be more important, this phenomenon, in larger cities. For example, if we compare cities of, let's say, 250,000 and more population with those smaller of 100,000 population, we see that the larger ones are 3 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding areas, which is almost twice as high as in cities with smaller size. So just close with this, and just close by saying that we keep working, trying to contribute to this debate, and we rely a lot on all the scientific community, not only from member countries, and on the use that will improve over time of new sources of data, which in this domain is particularly important, as I just said. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paolo. It's good to hear how much progress is already being made within the OECD. And I think this will be of huge help to all the countries that we're working with that are actually still grappling in having an information base on the kinds of risks that they're confronting at the right scale. So oftentimes we see that there's sort of national risk assessments or a fair idea of what is on the horizon for a country, largely speaking, but downscaling these risks and having downscale protections available is still hard to come by, especially at the city level. So now we have 5 more minutes. As I hear, we're having a slight change of plans. So we will skip the break, if I understand properly, and move right into the next session, which allows us and our panelists to take 1 or 2 questions from the floor. And I'll take one perhaps here if I don't see a hand. If anyone wants to raise a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand electronically or put your question in the chat function. And in the absence of having an electronic hand for the time being, I'm taking a question that is written here for Maurizio. And I think you can see it as well, Maurizio, if you want to read along. Hang on so that I can read it properly. There's a question about a risk atlas and related policies in Quito. Do we know how local populations were involved in the preparation of this risk atlas and the resulting policies? And are there any good practice examples coming out of this exercise? Mauricio.
Yes, actually, yeah, people were, I mean, the community was a very important component of the exercise, because we wanted to hear from them exactly the kind of risks that in their perception they have, right? That's very important. I mean, we had technical data, historical data about what areas in the city were most impacted by natural hazards. But of course, there's also a very important perception component from the population. So yes, we did engage the population on this exercise. I think that it was a very insightful aspect of the development of the risk atlas, and actually it allowed us then to work with the community on developing protective measures to the kind of specific risks that were associated with a particular area. So, for example, if a particular neighborhood of the city was identified as prone to floods, we work afterwards with the community to tell them exactly what to do in case of a flooding episode, right? And to hear from them what they have been doing before, because that's also very interesting to learn about, you know, the popular wisdom about how to deal with these things, and then to combine that with technical aspects to develop appropriate protective measures. So yes, because I know we're running out of time, we engage the community not only in identifying the risks, but also in identifying the solutions or the protective measures that were relevant to that particular risk in every area of the city that was identified as risk prone. And if you ask me about some other examples, I cannot tell you, there's not a case at hand that comes to mind at this point, but I'm sure that many other cities have done the same exercise.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. And there's maybe a very brief last question we can take for anyone in the panel who would like to pick it up. So please just unmute yourself if you want to respond to it. Asking if there's any good practice examples or concrete solutions at the urban level for building climate resilience in cities. So a relatively broad question. If one of you wants to highlight a sort of a good practice case in addition to the ones you've already mentioned, please unmute yourself and intervene from the floor now. No? Anna, go ahead, please.
I mean, sure. There's a lot, I think, to draw on in terms of practice around urban planning solutions, and I think a lot of folks here probably have some great examples to highlight, and OECD certainly. I just wanted to point to some examples from some work that I was involved in Asia, where there was a process of cities going through a practice of understanding risk and vulnerability and looking at how climate risks overlays with other trends, rapid urbanization, looking at poverty and vulnerability. And out of that grew a set of projects that were focused on a range of climate specific hazards, but also integrating into a range of measures. So I just was talking to some folks in Da Nang in Vietnam last week who were involved in a project to upgrade homes to be more resilient to cyclones, which are just prevalent to begin with, and then climate change makes that more prominent. And there was a fund that was set up with the local women's union and a bunch of other stakeholders to basically create additional funds for women-headed household, but also just low-income folks to upgrade their homes to endure wind, higher wind speeds, as well as some flood events. And not only have there a number of homes been, hundreds of homes been upgraded, but the fund has actually become a budget item within the city. So it's now part of normalized mainstream practice. And as well, the fund has been, it's been completely, there's been no defaults to speak of. So it's been kind of replenished in a great way. So I think that's just a small example of how resilience and adaptation can get mainstreamed into city budgets and into practices.
Excellent, Anna. Thank you so much. Mark, did you want to add anything very, very briefly before we hand over to Enrique for the next session?
Yeah, just a brief addition in terms of adaptation options. For sure, there's lots out there in the literature, but I guess being mindful of the global goal for adaptation, there's a question that follows from that, which is, who is it that determines what successful adaptation looks like and should be funded? And what are the criteria through which that assessment will be made? So just to flag, it's not just about deploying adaptation, but it's understanding who it is that judges and what criteria are used to determine whether adaptation is seen as successful. And very often the same adaptation project or outcome can be judged very differently depending upon your viewpoint, whether you're the resident whose house or area has been adapted or not, whether you're the resident whose house or area has been affected by somebody else's adaptation, or whether you're a city manager or national policy actor. So I think as we move towards a global goal for adaptation, those questions of who and what are the criteria will become increasingly important. Thank you.
That's right, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about this at the COP in November in Sharm el-Sheikh on this discussion precisely. I think with this, and to not take away too much time of the panelists and the discussions in the next session, I think we have to come to a close. Tadashi had instructed me of giving him a sort of a list of good practices and recommendations coming out of this session. And I think there are manifold. So I'm very happy to transcribe them on paper and hand them over in paper and not take more time in this session. But what I would like to do is thank everyone for taking the time to speak today, and for the participants who raised questions and who contributed to the discussion through the chat function. And I apologize that we don't have more time to discuss, because I'm sure there would be many more questions that everyone has for these interesting panelists. Thank you all very, very much. And with that, I hand over to Enrique for the next session.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And indeed, it's been a very interesting session, the one that you just moderated. And I think our session, which is the second one, builds on some of these points, which aims at discussing a little bit the synergies and co-benefits with other systems in the cities. And for that, we also have a number of very good participants with us today. We have 3 speakers that you can read on the presentation, and our own discussant, Oriana, will be also making an intervention. And I have also been told that we are running tight on time. So I would like to remind our speakers to stick with their 7-minute allocated time. And if they take too long, I will use my moderating ability and try to control a bit of time, because I think it's important that we get some time for the questions and answers session. Maybe before I pass on the full floor to the first speaker, just remind a little bit some of the questions that we're trying to respond in this session, which aim at thinking a little bit more around a system. What are the synergies and co-benefits that we can have in addressing some of these risks to mitigate a little bit, to increase the resilience of cities. Another very interesting question is, what is it different, this climate resilient development, from the traditional urban development in dealing with some of these shocks? And the third question is how to better align some of these recovery strategies that are emerging from COVID-19 pandemic to sort of like a transformative effect, how to make use of some of those investments well. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor now to our first speaker. Omar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm not going to use slides. I'm going to try and speak to some core issues here, because I think between Mark and Anna and other colleagues in the last session, they've laid out a lot of the evidence. So before I get to the 3 questions, I think it's important to look at some very fundamental and simple things which will help us understand or how we have to kind of potentially build systemic resilience in cities. The first one is to understand the regime that we're in. We're at 1.1 degrees of global, air surface temperature above the pre-industrial at the current point in time. When we started a lot of this journey about 30 years ago, at Rio, we were about less than half of that. So we're not doing well at all. In fact, we're not doing well at all is very clear, because in spite of the COVID kind of pause, we're still on track to probably overshooting 1.5 in the next decade, plus minus a few years. So that's a real challenge. And we've been trying to deal with it. I kind of co-led the chapter that looked at implementation in the IPCC 1.5 report. The issue here, of course, is not 1.5. The issue is that the NDCs are setting us up to reach 2.7 or somewhere between 2.7 and 3.1. And remember, this is global average surface temperature close to the equator. At the moment, there are already many places in the world that even at 1.1 or 1.5 are going to have temperature elevations of more than 4 degrees. So the obvious impact of that in terms of heat waves, etc., is pretty obvious. But the more important thing is that urban areas, even today, and you can see that in the evidence in working group 1, are experiencing in many places much higher elevations than 1.5, partially because of where they are and partially because of urban heat islands. So basically, when we're talking about adaptation or resilience, we are already on track on a rather difficult pathway. In fact, I would say the challenge that we have is to do 2 things. One is work dramatically hard at trying to make sure that our emissions get us lower than 2, hopefully below 1.5 at the global scale. Obviously, cities will have it much higher in most places. But simultaneously, we would be extremely foolish if we did not prepare to adapt to 2.7 and above. Now, that's a very challenging and sort of dichotomous situation to deal with. You want to try and make sure that deep decarbonization, dealing with mitigation, dealing with negative emissions, etc., are going to keep you below 2 or closer to 1.5. But simultaneously, you absolutely have to prepare for way above 2 and 3. And again, the chapter that Mark and I wrote in the AR5 report in 2014 basically said that if you reach the 2070s and you're at 2 degrees and above, it really makes no difference whether you're sitting in London or New York, or you're sitting in Dar es Salaam, or let's say Dakar or Dhaka. Effectively, the ecosystem services and the systems that allow cities to remain where they are going to go beyond our means of being able to adapt. Right? I mean, we call it lots of interesting names today, but basically, our ecosystem services will collapse, so whether it's water or food or a whole range of other things. And the biodiversity crisis is following on from the climate crisis. We're going to be in a very, very serious challenge because we actually don't know how to deal with this. There's a lot of talk about ecosystem-based adaptation, also about nature-based solutions. But the question is, will they work and how will they work at 2.5, 3 degrees, at the global level? Which means in some cases we're talking about EBA and NBS at 6, 7, 8 degrees above the pre-industrial level. So we don't really have good reasons of how to deal with that. So what does that mean? It basically means that you cannot build systemic resilience only by focusing on cities, right? Cities will effectively fail because they depend very critically across the world on a whole range of other processes, whether it's supply chains at one end, or it's a question of the regions in which they're embedded for critical ecosystem services and support. So we shouldn't make that mistake in some senses. So I know a lot of mayors are very brave, but the fact is neither mayors nor heads of state and government can actually do this without working together. So there's a new set of arrangements that need to be brought into place to actually make this happen. And finally, even when we're dealing with adaptation, and I spent many, many years working on adaptation, mitigation is absolutely central. In fact, it's our first line of defense. It is because we are unable to or fail to mitigate both inside cities and across city regions and countries that we are having to deal with extreme and in some senses transformative adaptation or even maladaptation. So that's a context in some ways. So then to come to the first question that you have, and that is, how is climate resilient development different from urban development? I sort of co-led the chapter on this. I won't quote chapter and verse on this, but I guess the first thing is that traditional urban development does not even make the basic standards of sustainable development. Fine. So we have SDG 11, which is focused on sustainable cities and communities. We're not there in most parts of the world, but more important, when we negotiated SDG 11, there were a lot of things that were left out of that frame, which are absolutely critical to what we're hearing today about dealing with vulnerability. You cannot only address the concerns that we have in SDG 11 around transportation, around buildings, around green open spaces, etc., without, in many parts of the world, especially in the developing world, dealing with questions of poverty, dealing with questions of food security. We can see what's happening because of a conflict in a relatively small part of the world across the rest of the world, dealing with questions of inequality, which are absolutely central in urban areas. Because urban areas create tremendous opportunities, but they also concentrate risk, they concentrate poverty, they concentrate conflict, and they sort of concentrate a whole range of systemic processes that we have to address as we're going forward. It's not only the positive elements of economic development, productivity, job creation, and institutions that we have. So the first thing is traditional urban development doesn't take into account the entire spectrum of processes that we should be dealing with when we're dealing with the framework of sustainable development. And as Mark laid out, the framing that's emerging in this sort of in the literature and debates at the moment are that climate resilient development is not only sustainable development or dealing with sustainable development in cities and regions, it's also bringing together adaptation and mitigation. And adaptation and mitigation, of course, are constructs. But one of the most significant challenges that we have is there are, of course, tremendous areas for convergence and co-benefits, and dealing with air pollution, for example, is one classic example. Actually building and managing cities that are more livable and walkable, etc., is another example. But there is, in this regime that I was talking about, a very serious issue, and that is if we need to maintain elevations below 2 degrees in the current regime, given the way that emissions are going, we will have to actually have to sort of take recourse to what we call negative emission technologies, or a whole range of mechanisms to be able to capture carbon. Fine. Now, there's very little understanding of how carbon can be captured in cities, but the fact that we have to deploy these processes in are going to lead to a whole range of operational challenges and serious, I would say, trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation. So for mitigation, you really need to sequester and bring down carbon. That leads to a whole range of conflicts as far as land, water, soil, and place are concerned that we don't necessarily understand very well. And in a planet in which urbanization is not only growing, but our urban footprints are growing dramatically, that's an sort of an area that we don't understand very well, and hence the point that I was making, you cannot address systemic climate resilience.
If I can please get the first panelist to come short, so we leave time for the other speakers as well.
Great, and I will just close with a very simple example here. So we have a lot of focus on responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the statistics on this, the actual redirection of finances and resources, which are very important, are actually not happening in most places. Even in the European Green Deal, in effect, we have probably less than 20% of the resources that are flowing into climate resilient development kind of investments. So there's a long way to go in trying to make this happen. And this will require changes in governance, changes in financing most critically, and also partnerships that connect from citizens, local enterprises, local governments, all the way up to national and international governments. So I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Armar, for highlighting some of these complexities that need to be aligned, and also to remind the need to work with partnerships and together between cities, between levels of government. I think you've touched upon some of these in a nice way. Without further ado, we now have our second speaker, Jan. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose, and hi everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly, and I'm very, very pleased to join this webinar with so distinguished panel, and very happy to find again Aroma and Lina, and to have a discussion with Oriana. Bonjour, Oriana. So to be short, because there is so many important things that has been said before in the first roundtable and before with Aroma, I can be very short, because maybe the first answer, very short answer for your first question is you need and you have to have a very perfect climate action plan. Is maybe one of the best solutions, but you have to take care of what you put in your climate action plan. You know, I've been working for climate change issues and climate change policies for city for now 25 years. And if you look on background on city, how they try to tackle climate change issues during the first years, 20 years ago, the first climate action plan in the north of the planet was only to try to mitigate and to talk about energy, to talk about maybe sometime renewable energy, and to talk about infrastructure. Even if you forgot, when you try to have green infrastructure, sometimes you have gray energy in, and so GHG emissions. And if you look at climate action plan for the city from the south and more for city from the tropical and equatorial areas, they talk about adaptations. And recently, now, when you talk about climate change issues at any cities, you talk about both. So first, that's one of the answers. But if you look now at some very, very recent, like Paris Climate Action Plan, but it's not the only one, you have so many subtitles in the climate action plan. It's a climate action plan to achieve Paris Agreement, so to become carbon neutral, but to be more resilient, to be fairer, to integrate more and more people, inclusive, and so on. And that's very, very important. And see why maybe we talk about climate justice and to take care of everything. And let me take some examples. At the beginning, when we talk about how to decrease the impact of mobility, some very bad ideas, and specifically in France, in Europe, we say, oh, we can have diesel car because it's very less CO2 consumers, but we have bad air quality thanks to that. And now, if you have a very good climate action plan, you have to take care about climate action, how to mitigate, but of course about air quality and impact on health. So it's what you have multiple co-benefits as you ask, if you have a very climate action plan, very holistic, because you have to take account, for example, about the GHG emission generated not only in your ground, but also outside, because every day you consume electricity. Usually electricity is not provided from your ground, but just far away. And the same for agriculture, because you consume every day foods on your city grounds, and usually you don't have any agriculture fields, so you have to take care of that. And so if you take care of that, you take care how you produce that, how you import that, how you move the food to your city, and maybe you can have a discussion about the organic food, the impact of health, the short circuits, and the solidarity also with the rural areas, the countryside close to your cities, how to maintain jobs and so. One of the questions is maybe how to develop a good climate action plans. And one of the main solutions, as it was said before, is not, of course, only one top-down policy. It should be a bottom-up policy with all the stakeholders, all the citizens, but also, as it was said by Aroma just before, align with all the upscale and level up policy from regional level, national level, for us, for example, European level, because you have to align everyone, but with the same share of the vision with everyone, and to explain to everyone companies, citizens, how we can manage together and what steps you can do. That's one of the main success of the solution. And to avoid that there is one policy in this size and one another one, because we let a lot of people behind the line and a lot of energy poverty or precarity increase in our cities. On the second question, to be maybe faster, when I read the first time the question about the traditional urban development, finally, I don't know what is a traditional urban development, because it depends on your background of the city, it depends where you are implement. And of course, you can compare a development now. There is no more urban development in Paris area, for example, compared to Joburg or Abidjan, when they have to welcome every year 50 to 100,000 more people every year. That's not the same case for us. But the word traditional make me think about what we talk about, conventional energy, you know, or fossil fuel energy. What do you want to talk about? How we developed before city, well, about fossil fuel, and now we have to develop renewable energy sources, new urban development, how to avoid, of course, sprawling, but how to manage it. And there is not only one solution. We have to adapt. And as I said, you have to adapt and think the solution with everyone. And of course, and Aroma can discuss more than I about that, about human settlements in global south, in not the same that is north. And we have to take care of that, of course, about climate justice and to protect everyone. And for the last one, what we have learned from the crisis of COVID-19, and we can use maybe to foster and to accelerate. The first thing that it's a common good for everyone, every cities, we maybe rediscover all the solidarity we can have between all the inhabitants, the citizens, between the elders and the youngers, between also the small companies that they can create some mask, for example, when there is no mask in your country and so on. And we have to use it. We try to in Paris, but we have to use it to generate a new positive dynamic about how to tackle crisis. Because if you talk every day about climate emergency, about the crisis and so on, everybody will be depressed. And you have to draw with everyone a positive future if you want to have people in with. It's very, very important, and especially with all the pressure made by the youths, and they are right, but we have to work with them how to deal a positive country, positive cities with them. And what we have learned too is how to forget sometimes about all the globalizations of our cities or our needs, and how to develop short circuit, as I said, for agriculture, for fooding, for the first materials, and how we can reconnect the cities with a close interland, with a close countryside, and to make solidarity, because we don't want to have a very carbon neutral, resilient, and a very maybe high technology cities compared to rural countryside far away with dinosaurs, with low income and so on. No, we have to work together because we need, as it was said before, each other, and it's very, very important. So maybe it's to increase solidarity between all the different actors and all the different people, and align the policy in one on the main message that I want to send today. Thank you. I hope I respect my time.
Indeed, and thank you so much for respecting your time and also for addressing the three questions. I think you made some very good points, and the importance to mobilize and to work in partnership, not with this top-down approach. I think that was quite interesting to deal with the complexities and building and addressing some of the synergies and complementarities that you mentioned. I think we'll pass now to our third speaker, Lina. Again, you have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a challenge to follow Jan as a speaker in the great city of Paris, so I'll do my best here. So I think that we all agree that cities are facing multiple crises, but also multiple competing agendas. And into the Resilient Cities Network for almost a decade, we've been working with cities from around the globe in identifying what are these transformative actions, policies, investments that will not only make our cities safer, but at the same time will yield benefits that will improve the lives and the well-being of its citizens. And urban resilience is not just about responding or surviving to the different crises and shocks, but it's actually, and I have some slides. I don't know if you can share them. Next slide, please. And urban resilience is not just about responding or surviving the crisis, but actually learning, adapting, and thriving in the face of these adversities. Next slide, please. It is our conviction that you cannot build resilience unless you are able to address the various challenges across the various levels and layers of the city, tangible and intangible. And that includes, of course, governance. So to date, there are more than 90 cities across the world that have created these offices of resilience, these positions of the chief resilience officers that work across departments and across communities within and outside of the city. And they are conveners, they are problem solvers, they're incubators of new innovative approaches. They are the ones that try to articulate and create stories and raise awareness, but at the same time try to connect the global goals and the global frameworks with what is happening on the ground. And here you can see just a snapshot of some of the themes and the projects these resilience teams are working. Next slide, please. To make it more tangible, I would like to highlight two projects from the region I work mostly closely with in Europe that encompass these values. The first is Rotterdam's first resilient neighborhood. So Resilient Bolto tries to empower the two neighborhoods of Bospolder and Dijken, apologies to my Dutch fellows, the pronunciation, to become the city's first resilient district. And by doing it by directing transformative infrastructure construction and social programs to help people manage debt, access education for both adults and children, find better employment, and improve the housing quality. So Resilient Bolto is a direct application and interpretation of cutting-edge urban resilience thinking. It combines a number of tracks of work in the city, such as transitioning to sustainable energy, upgrading housing stock, building to live with water and heat, social inclusion and integration. It weaves them together to find projects that achieve multiple benefits in a highly consultative process that is very responsive to the needs and of the most impacted inhabitants. This is a 10-year plan. It has a very unique bottom-up governance structure that has put in place. It's not a program that has been, but it is managed by the city hall or a department that sits in the municipal building, but actually it is managed within the neighborhood with very specific measurable indicators that have been defined with the communities of the city. Next slide, please. So Belfast has historically been a place of conflict where people have been cut off from the center. The city has been working on trying to make the city a more human-centered city. The council actually decided that they wanted to put the youngest in the population at the driving seat. So they structured an approach that focuses on how to make the city center a more playful, child-friendly space. By using this as an entry point, the city was not able to provide, facilities for children, but found a way to bring back nature to cities by integrating nature-based solutions within the public spaces. The dialogue that opened the city opened with the children elevated and highlighted the need for more nature, which also led to another project and another target of planting 1 million trees. Next slide, please. So these were just two indicative examples. There are multiple similar projects that are happening across the globe. The Paris Oasis schoolyards is a similar example. And what are some, let's say, learnings that from this kind of approaches? So the importance of creating, of course, the right governance structures. This is not only about participation, it's about co-ownership. In both cases, the programs aligned with an overarching strategy of the city in both cases with the resilience strategy or the agenda, the city agenda of the city, in a way that showed that they were not just outliers or pilots, but actually contributed tangibly to the overall mission of the city. Then you cannot have climate resilience without strengthening social cohesion. So in both projects, we see that even if the entry point, so in the first case, actually energy transition was the entry point. This is where they had money. This is where the city had money to invest. But through this, they were able to weave and integrate social programs, and nature-based solutions were applied. But all of this was integrated. It was not, oh, this is a climate resilient project. Oh, this only contributes at our net zero target. But actually all of this together was a program that, again, there was consensus among both the communities and the city that it was important. And in the Belfast case, as you saw, the entry point was different. The entry point was how to make our city more playful, more child-friendly. And this actually brought the climate agenda at the forefront, which, to be honest, was not a political priority at that moment. Finally, there is a big issue in terms of how these projects are actually financed. And in most cases, these are city budgets. And then you might have, EU budget that come after there is a proof of concept, but then what? So what is the role of other investors or the private sector or other financial institutions in supporting these kind of projects that we've seen actually create impact and yield multiple benefits? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. And I think you made some very good points around the need for government structures to align and to kind of like build these partnerships that you mentioned about before. I also like your distinction about it's not about participation, but co-ownership. And thanks again for the concrete examples you provided on your presentation. Before I pass on to our discussant, our own Oriana, maybe I just remind the speakers, if you wish to ask any question, please go ahead and do that in the chat. We'll have a small questions and answer session at the end, but Oriana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Enrique. Very happy to be here. Just an honor to speak after these amazing speakers. Well, what I would like to highlight is that what I heard in the last 20 minutes was a sequence of is not just about or is not only. Starting from Lena, she said climate resilience is not just about responding but learning. Jan said the climate adaptation plans are not just about climate but also inclusiveness, fairness and justice. Aromar said that it's not just about urban development, but also food, water security, poverty, especially in some places of the world. So this shows that we are leading towards the direction of a systemic approach where everything is connected to everything else. And so this idea of a systemic approach for the co-benefit in relation to climate resilience is absolutely essential. And this reminds me also of a framework that we developed first in our water governance work and then applied also to the circular economy work, which was based on the 3 P's approach: people, policies, and places. When we talked about people in the water sector, well, it's not just about what governments can do, but there are a plethora of stakeholders that play an important role, from operators, from association, private and non-for-profit sectors. And indeed, this idea of engaging the stakeholders within the definition of the policies and an implementation is absolutely key for the success of the policies themselves. The second P stands for policies, because it's not just about water, as in the circular economy is not just about waste. We have to link these policies in a way that fundings, for example, are used effectively, but also outcomes across the policies are expecting to bring a core benefit to all these sectorial policies. So waste can actually be detrimental from pollution of water. From water, we can have energy, without mentioning the link between water and food. So we cannot even thinking of working in silos. And the third piece stands for places. It was already highlighted that when we talk about urban areas, we are not talking about the administrative boundaries. There is an input and output of resources between urban, rural areas, regional scales. So it is very important to highlight the connections across the places. So really the functionalities of the places where economic, environmental, and social activities take place. I'm just concluding this very brief intervention to say that now we are applying again this approach of the 3 Ps to something that we think is very much at the heart of many of the cities and that have been mentioned throughout the course of this webinar, in particular, for example, coastal city, delta city, fluvial city, that have to deal with blue economy activities. So they are very much dependent on water, but at the same time, there cannot be economic resilience without water resilience. So preventing from water-related risk is absolutely key for the urban and the regional development of many places. I stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oriana. I think you made some very interesting points on with your discussion. Very, very interesting insights. Just before I open the floor to a bit of Q&A, there's some comments about how to engage the communities, and I think Oriana, you touched about this need for this holistic approach, and how to build these partnerships and how to come up with effective ways of working together. If I can go back to the speakers to go a bit deeper in these points, what sort of governance arrangements or what sort of policies or incentives you think are effective on building these synergies, because oftentimes they don't occur by themselves. You need to have either, some of the speakers were saying a top-down approach doesn't work, but many times a top-down approach can facilitate or can provide incentives to bring all these actors together. So maybe if I can deepen a little bit your thoughts on what do you think, how can we build these synergies either through a governance or a policy or other types of initiatives, that would be great. So maybe our first speaker, Omar, if you have any insights on that.
But I think the first thing is that you have to recognize everybody in the city. I mean, all citizens have to be recognized. That's a big challenge in many parts of the world, because unless you're able to reduce vulnerability and make sure that all the basic services, and today the internet is almost a basic services, are provided to everybody, you're not going to be able to build resilience. You can't build community, you can't build relationships between different parts of the city. So I would say that's the fundamental basis of dealing with that. And that includes city governments, recognizing their citizens and strengthening their ability to do stuff. Because if you're able to do it, that will actually strengthen processes. And then the partnerships that are required at the neighborhood level and across the city, across various different kind of agents. Because if you're not able to deal with livelihoods, you will not be able to build any kind of economic resilience, fine? That means bringing in the private sector of various scales and sizes, recognizing informality in many parts of the world. Informality is not something that's only in cities of the global south, it's also in the north, because energy poverty, all kinds of other asymmetries are visible in North America and Europe. So you do need to be able to address those questions. And finally, you have to have a governance system that recognizes that you have to integrate across multiple levels, both resources and capacities, and look forward, not look at 3-year, 4-year, 5-year electoral cycles, because if people are going to live for 80 years, you're going to build a city and the infrastructure that's going to lock them in. You have some real challenges.
Thank you very much. Jan, I don't know if you have any insights on.
Yeah, it's a very great question. And, of course, we implement sometimes top-down policy because even if we try to work on this policy before with everyone, at one moment you need a decision from the city council to advocate and to make lobby maybe sometime to the state for this policy, and also you have to find founders to manage this policy. But you have to be sure that, as it was said before, that the impact will be positive for everyone, and you have to explain that, and also how to associate everyone for the governance. Let me take maybe one short example. We launched very many years ago a program to retrofit social dwellings, because as everywhere, we have to decrease the energy demands of social dwellings. And we begin this environmental program to decrease gigawatt, because with gigawatt you have GHG emissions. But at the end, we decrease by 50–60% the energy demands for each family, each tenant. So finally, they earn 50% of the bills. So we increase the power purchase for any family, and we decrease energy poverty, and we created 5,000 new jobs. So finally, it's a co-benefits policy. But we have to share with everyone, and sometimes when we want to explain to people that we have to implement, because we need the authorization of the tenants to retrofit the flats, say, oh no, I don't want, there is so many dust, there is so many noise, I don't want to leave my flats, and so on. Or at the end also, you try to explain that, but you will earn money. But currently, with the price of the energy that are increasing and increasing, you say that maybe you will you will have by 2 your energy bills, and finally when the price of the gas doubles, people say, hey, you lied to me. Oh, mayor, you lied to me because I have to, my bill is the same. No, the same because the price increase and we decrease. But you need to convince, you need to explain every day, and that's very important. It's not, even if it's a top-down or bottom-up policy, it's a daily work to associate everyone at each time, and not only 5 years to create a policy and to come back in 5 years to publish a report. It's a daily work with everyone, and with citizens and with communities. It's very important to work with social workers and so on. With, as said, aroma companies, it's maybe more easier. You can sign a contract, a charter and so on to have communication, and they will follow. But with communities, we have to go there because they are not in our public debate. People that are coming in our public debate are already aware about climate change issues. We are to go in the ground, in the public spaces, to discuss with everyone and to find solutions together.
Thank you very much. Lena, do you have any insights?
A few things are just to follow up on Jan. Consistency is the key. It's not just one-off, as he said. Transparency in order to create trust. Otherwise, there is, it's just for the perception of wanting to get other voices included. Now, although we see more and more cities trying to include communities into their design and implementation, the problem is that there is a lack of capacity and knowledge within the municipality, within the municipal employees. This is not something that they learned somewhere, or this is a practice that has changed. So we see some cities that create a dedicated office or department that works and creates capacity and training to other employees. But there are many, many, many cities, and the majority of the cities that we work with, that they don't know how. So this is also the role of international organizations and funders and networks to help the cities and help the employees to build this capacity, knowledge, and have this kind of armor to kind of effectively create these dialogues. And the last comment, we are in an era of polarization, and public discourse has been difficult, and we need to recognize it. So we see cities, battling a lot as they try to communicate and raise awareness, while at the same time you have all of these things that happen in the media and the fake news and all of it. So kudos to the cities and people like Jan and his colleagues that actually are going out and are doing this work.
Thank you very much for these points. Oriana, do you have any insights you want to share on this point?
Oh, I think just to highlight once again that here, and I think it has been discussed, that it's not a problem of implementing a technical solution to reach certain objectives. It's really managing the complexity and so getting the governance right. So it's a matter of how to engage with stakeholders, how to increase the transparency, how to move from planning to implementation, how to combine the trade-off across people and make sure that in fact also information awareness is raised, and so that within this systemic and holistic approach, those that are the doers, so the implementation of these policies, are actually engaged since the very beginning of the political process.
Great, thanks for being concise and trying to respond. I see that there's a couple of questions came out a little bit later. Unfortunately, I've been told that we need to wrap this session up quickly and pass on to the next. Before that, I would really like to thank the three speakers and the discussant. I think it was a great intervention, a lot of interesting insights. And with that said, I'll pass it to the next moderator, Catherine Anderson, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose. I understand that we're going to run a Mentimeter. Is that correct, Taya? Wonderful.
Yes,
So what we'd really like to hear from each of you as participants. I think we have a couple of specific questions that we want to run through this Mentimeter. So you see on your screen the code that is to be put into the system. So when you log into the website, please enter the code that you see, and that should give you an opportunity to answer the questions posed.
Matteo, you can take over if you can animate this part.
Yes, thank you very much. Nice to meet you all. My name is Matteo Ledesma. I am part of this team contributing to the OECD Horizontal Project on Climate Action and Resilience. So as Catherine just said, we have prepared a couple of questions for you. So I hope you are all set with the link and with the questions. So okay, we have already many responses. So we do have some winners, and there are relocation of people and firms. So the question is, what are the top 3 environmental climate-related effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in your city? Less commuting, relocation of people and firms to suburbs or smaller cities, more demand for non-motorized transport, more demand for urban green space, pressure on waste management systems, others. So if you are making others, we invite you to put this in the chat. So we see there are all important. There are all important effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in your city, but I think we have some, let's give some 30 seconds to allow more people to come in. But we have more demand for urban green space, so that relates perfectly with all that has been said in the previous section around building the resilience by creating new urban green areas and so on. Less commuting is now increasing, so it's true that thanks to the pandemic we have reduced a bit the need for commuting given the teleworking arrangements and so on. So I think we can move to the second question. So I will just pass the slide to the next question, which is, what are the top 3 indirect effects of climate shocks that should be taken into account in climate risk assessment? So this relates to the information that we have heard in session 1 about this building more integrated risk assessment frameworks. So please respond. I am seeing some responses coming now. The options are displacement of population, disruption of urban public services, example, water, energy, transport, decrease of labor productivity or economic activities, damages to cultural assets and decrease of tourism activities, disruption in manufacturing supply chain, degrade ecosystems, rise in consumer prices. So we are seeing a tendency here. We have disruption of urban public services as one of the main indirect effects of the climate change in cities, and that completely relate to all that has been said by our panelists regarding the inclusion of more and more topics within this climate risk assessment framework. So disruption, then we have degraded ecosystems and displacement of population. So thank you very much for your responses, and let's move very quickly to the last question so that we can be on time for the next session. So this one is regarding the essential actions or the key elements to build systemic climate resilience. So what are the top 3 actions you consider essential to making cities resilient to further climate-related shocks? So expand the risk assessment to unpredictable risk, develop climate adaptation and resilience strategies at the metropolitan scale, engage diverse population groups in the entire policy cycle, combine approaches and goals to maximize co-benefits, localize the national adaptation plans and strategies, and foster collaborative climate action across the different levels of government, as well as accelerate digital transformation. So responses are coming. We see the importance of engaging different groups, different stakeholders. So again, this is clearly a line of what we have been discussing during the session. Foster collaborative climate action across levels of governments. So this is an important topic, and I see this clearly relate to the next session of our workshop. So thank you very much all for all your responses, and back to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mateo, and I'm sure that the team will reflect on those and sort of share the insights that resulted from that with you. So this next session, I mean, we've heard already today about many of the attributes of systemic resilience. And of course, in those discussions, we've really understood the centrality of coordinating and engaging diverse actors and different groups. And that's for many reasons, of course. Obviously, we're wanting to be aware of and to consider structural inequities, particular kinds of vulnerabilities that might be emerging from variations of risk. We want to recognise sort of formal and informal constituencies and views of climate risks and responses. We're looking very much to enable partnerships and co-ownership. And we've heard that this is very much about not only responding, but also learning and co-production, essentially. So we know that the coordination and engagement is extremely important. In the climate space, we've got constellations of different kinds of actors, private sector researchers, philanthropists, public officials, but also institutions and sources of financing. So we've got a series of questions here, but the central sort of question that's really posed is how do we enable that coordination and engagement across and among these different constituencies so that we can really bring collective capabilities to bear on the challenge of climate resilience in urban centres. So we've got an all-star panel. And I'm going to try and keep everyone fairly strictly to time. We do have a hard stop at 16:20. So just to begin, we're going to be hearing from Professor Eugenie Birch. She is the Nussdorf Professor of Urban Research at the University of Pennsylvania and co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Design. And we're very much looking forward, Professor Birch, to hearing from you as to how we can connect the different levels of governance and engagement that we need to be thinking about in responding and enabling our systemic climate resilience. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This has been a really exciting and informative session so far. And one of the themes that has come forward and which we just saw in the survey is the importance of managing diverse stakeholders and urban actors in this environment. Next slide, please. So as we think about this, we have to understand the enabling environment and who's there. We need to identify the relevant groups. We need to understand how they define resilience. We need to see what are their areas of common interest. What are the tension points among them? How do they operate? Do they understand the systems approach? Are they focused on their own sectoral interests? What are the ways we can find to promote dialogue, to raise consciousness about their policies and policies that are needed, and can we inventory their projects? Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the supranational institutions and transnational networks. The resilience, as we have heard, falls under many global frameworks. First of all, we have the United Nations and all of its agreements, the Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, and the means for reporting on those. For example, 2030 is the HLPF with the national reports, but also the voluntary local reports, which are very important for bringing together these groups. And the Paris Agreements, we have the NDCs. We haven't seen a lot of local participation in those, but that's another area that we can be thinking about that. And finally, in the New Urban Agenda, the quadrennial report also needs to incorporate local participation. There are global alliances and their engagement groups, for example, G7, and we had good news that urban is being included in their declaration. There's the G20 with its engagement group. There's APEC, Specialized Energy Group, that also looks at cities. What are they doing? They're convening, they're creating advocacy situations with campaigns. I'm thinking of the UNFCCC and its Race to Resilience and the Champions. We're thinking about the networks that exist, the GCOM, the Global Parliament of Mayors, C40, UCLG, ICLE, Resilience Rising Resilience Network, the Atlantic Council, Brookings, OECD, tremendous numbers of people and groups involved in it, depending upon which segment they come from. And how are they developing policy and contributing to it, and what implementation activities are they engaged in? How are they investing in activities, and how do they monitor them? The next slide, please. I'd like to really start at looking at dissecting government and the national and subnational issues that we have to think about, because it is within these governmental frameworks that the multi-stakeholder participation is so very necessary. And it's really important to understand this. And we know, for example, the number of local and regional governments is somewhere around 250,000, if you believe UCLG and the data that they collect. So what do we need to know in terms of understanding the structure and seeing where the intervention points are for the variety of groups that do exist? First of all, what kind of government at the national level exists? Is it unitary or federal? As you probably know, 87% of the national governments in the world are unitary. That means centralized authority, and only 13% are federal. So within this structure of unitary versus federal, what is the level of decentralization? How are their constitutions defining the responsibilities and powers of the various units within them, the subnational units within them, whether they're provinces and states or cities or metropolitan areas or regencies or whatever? There are frameworks that establish what the level of autonomy is within cities and how those cities can operate. We need to understand the administrative structure of how resilience is dealt with from the local to the global, from the local to the national. Who are the focal points for resilience? Resilience, as we know, is a big topic, and we saw all the areas it is covering, and there are agencies at the national level that deal with water, those that deal with disasters, those that deal with heat and so forth. So we have to understand who is the focal point at the national level, how does that come down to the state level, and how does that come down to the local level? Are there coordinating committees within within the national government? For example, a study we've just done for the CCFLA, which is the City Climate Leadership Finance Alliance, looking at enabling environments, shows that we did 2 case studies for Ecuador and Indonesia, shows that at both places, they have national coordinating committees for climate. And these bring together the national ministries and cut across the silos. We don't know how effective these are working, but they do exist. And the question is, do you have the same sort of structure as you'll go down the administrative arrangements down to the cities? what kind of information is given or produced by this administrative structure. And we know that we can find out about these administrative structures from a couple of sources. There's the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment database, which has tremendous information on this sort of thing. It's based at the London School of Economics, and it's also supported by the Sabin Center for Climate Change and Law at Columbia University. And that brings us, when we think about dissecting national and subnational government, what are the legislation and regulations? What is the existence of plans? There are climate plans, there are national urban policy plans, and national development plans. How does resilience fit into this? And what is their alignment, again, as you go down the levels of government, national to local? Are they aligned? In terms of legislation and regulation, how are cities treated? What is the fiscal policies of nations regarding to cities? Are they able to raise their own revenues? Can they borrow? Can they participate in public-private partnerships? All of these are legislated at the national to local level. And you need to understand this to have enable the multi-stakeholder participation that you need when you think about advocating and developing policy and implementing that policy. And we need to think about budget and finance. What are the sources of funding for localities? In unitary governments, 80% of the local revenues are basically intergovernmental transfers. In many countries, this is a tremendous issue with regard to whether the payments are intermittent or regular or formula-based. So localities often don't know when and what they're going to receive, whether the funding is restricted to particular targets, which then leads to siloization, which then fights against this idea of having a coordinated resilience activity.
Dr. Birch, just to say the last 1 minute.
Very good. The last things we have to think about are data and where it is and how we understand risks, which has been well discovered and talked about. I would refer you to the Joint Research Center, the Global Human Settlements Layer. WRI and GCOM have created a data portal measuring emissions for cities. They have 60,000 cities in 12 countries, and now we know OECD is working on the indicators. And finally, the question of capacity. Who's in charge? What power do they have? And what are the financial resources? Next slide, please. So as we think, in conclusion, of how we can have this kind of activity that coordinates the multi-stakeholder partnerships and activities, there are 5 steps that a city needs to do. First of all, it needs to map its needs, have its plans, and create stakeholder participation in that. Second, it needs to coordinate mitigation and adaptation and decide what it's going to do in that regard. Thirdly, it needs to determine appropriate policies to implement them. Fourth, it needs to support subsidiarity, as we've discussed. And 5, it needs to design new financing instruments for the implementation of these policies. This can only be done with coordination, with support of subsidiarity, national to local government, and understanding the enabling environment. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Gosh, well, that covered an enormous breadth and depth of considerations, of factors, if you will. So from sort of understanding risks to really understanding the administrative and coordinating architecture, the legal and regulatory environments, sources of information, but also really having an appreciation of sort of who is in charge and what kind of authority they have. And in all of these processes, trying to develop some kind of shared language and shared understanding of the particular challenges and responses that may be adopted. So fantastically rich beginning. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tenniel Parker, who I hope might be able to build on some elements of what Professor Birch has just laid out. So Ms. Parker is the Director of Disaster Recovery and Special Issues at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. She's responsible for a substantial disaster risk recovery fund and is going to share with us some of her very rich practical experiences. So over to you, Tenniel.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon to all who are participating today. The context for my comments and engagement with you this opportunity today is solely actually focused on urban communities. And that's a reflection of the particular experience I have the privilege of working with The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development is focused on certainly all communities throughout our country, however, particular focus on those urban areas, part of our charter, if you will. And so today, as we talk about climate risk in particularly the United States, in my case, but also in urban communities, what I will be drawing from are the experience of the 60+ communities that have had catastrophic natural disasters with disaster damage in the ranges of the billions to a couple hundred million, which is no small number, certainly in terms of US dollars, but it gives us some context. We'll also highlight the role of community engagement, equitable recovery and what that looks like and why those contexts are coming to bear fruit, if you will, in the current context. Next slide, please. As so many of the colleagues before me have shared the triggers and the shocks that particularly harm communities and are exacerbated in urban areas. I'm highlighting these not to be an exhaustive list, but it has some context for the social implications and the vulnerability highlights that I will discuss as we go forward. And so we're talking about extreme heat and drought and wildfires on the one context, and ironically in the United States, largely focused in our western and southwestern portions of the country, as well as riverine and inland flooding and coastal flooding. Coastal flooding brought on in tremendous amount by hurricanes. Next slide. So with that in mind, what is happening? How are we allowing these communities to not only thrive again, but to be resilient? And there's a more recent recognition that combating and mitigation are the key strategies, and it's not prevention. And so the federal coordination in response to disasters in our context is key. Having a national blueprint for that, the expectation that what can American citizens, what can citizens of various countries and urban communities expect across the country? And that is key for us here as we look at, particularly in the urban context, there will be solutions and strategies that are very local. But when we're talking about the rights of all of our countrymen, all of our citizens, this is where the federal framework comes into play. Notice, though, that my next point is that states drive local coordination. That is, those local jurisdictions, those municipal jurisdictions, counties, those entities drive coordination. And why is that? Isn't that making it a micro context? In fact, it's quite the opposite. There's a recognition that local governments have data, information, and context that cannot be accessible or may not be understood in the national or federal context. There's a saying here, all things are local. All politics is local. There's a key emphasis on those who reside in those communities, who use those systems day in and day out, have a clear understanding about the needs and challenges in the post-disaster and particularly mitigation context. The one piece, though, that we also have learned over these years is that the funding that's available for mitigation, for long-term disaster recovery in response to climate change can actually both drive and thwart the efforts of coordination. And so while there may be a federal fund, well, there may be, in our case, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funding, as well as other federal funds, those funds were not necessarily created to work together. And so each of those jurisdictions and jurisdictions around the world are trying to put together this pie of resources, this cadre of resources to figure out what they can use to mitigate against this type of hazard versus another. And that actually makes it very challenging for coordination at the local level, and particularly for urban communities who are likely the recipients and conduits for a variety of funding sources. Next slide. And so what are the key tools? Should we be giving up hope? Are urban communities capable of this? And the resounding answer is yes, but there are some lessons learned. One, we mentioned a framework, a federal framework, so that all communities are working towards the same set of principles. We in the United States are working from the National Disaster Recovery Framework, which was put together by our Federal Emergency Management Agency. So that federal entity, that national coordination, is led by the nation's emergency management team. But the membership of that framework includes every entity that touches the lives of citizens, whether it's housing and urban development or health and human services. The key component, or the next key component, is regional planning. There's a recognition about some of the success that we've seen in combating climate change and building resilience is that communities aren't just operating, jurisdictions and municipalities aren't just operating within their borders, they are forming partnerships across the river. They are forming partnerships with other jurisdictions that are adjacent. They are using those partnerships, those geographic ties, to then come up with solutions on a regional basis that allows those citizens and jurisdictions to come up with solutions that have mutual benefit and not harm to their neighboring jurisdictions. Intergovernmental agreements is another tool. If my neighbor to the east of me, my companion jurisdiction, my municipal jurisdiction to the east or west of me is having a crisis, I am engaging with them. I've agreed to come to their aid in a time of crisis. Many of you may know this as mutual aid, but there's a recognition that together, because we built these plans, we may also be the first line of defense for each other to aid in a time of extreme distress. One of the unique areas that we've seen, these last two, are watershed agreements, that communities that share common bodies of water that they are benefiting, and those outlets branch through multiple jurisdictions and states. They are forming partnerships to both preserve but ensure the availability of clean water in times of crisis, as well as manage the potential riverine and inland flooding that is often the case increasingly as a result of climate change. Normally,
less than a minute, Tanil.
Thank you. And so with these in mind, and the final slide, these are tools that all communities across the country and across the world can use, particularly in the urban context, to link and coordinate for their long-term efforts to both respond and have long-term recovery from catastrophic disasters, but also to mitigate climate change. In the chat, I have a variety of resources that I will post that allow you to find some more information, but it's been a pleasure to talk to you all this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tanil. I mean, really highlighting some of the practical tools that can be used to enable that connectivity, if you like, and the importance within that of ensuring that there's a cohesive interaction between the national level, federal level, in your case, and the state level, but ensuring also that there's that horizontality. So whatever is sort of happening within one particular state, it's not a zero-sum game with the other partnering communities, and that we're really sort of looking for win-win solutions. So I think lots of fabulous insights there. So we'd like to move on now. We're going to hear from David Giacomopolit. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, David. He is a senior officer for resilient development at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, but also comes to the panel with very rich experience as former Metropolitan Director of Resilience, again in the city of Quito in Ecuador. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm happy to see here former Mayor Mauricio Rodas and also my friend and colleague Lina Lico. Hi to both of them. So thank you for the first slide. ICLEI basically has, can we go back to the first one? Has 3 entry points: holistic approach, which is basically applying a resilience lens to all systems, institutions, and processes. Entry point 2 is about transparent and inclusive approaches, which is about using a whole of society approach involving citizens, businesses, universities, local and expert communities when identifying and reducing risks and vulnerabilities. And last but not least, entry point 3, network approach, which is about designing partnership strategies and identifying thematic and regional priorities and sharing lessons learned. I'm going to provide an example with one of the projects that we are working on right now here at ICLEI, so that you can have a better understanding of these 3 entry points. But before that, I would just like to mention or to introduce you what I'm about to what I am about to talk about. So first of all, we offer different programs. Access to finance is one of them. Capacity building, specifically for cities, which is very much needed. Knowledge building and exchange, of course, and global partnerships. One of those projects.
David, if you are changing slides, please say next slides, please.
Thank you. That is correct. Next slide, please. Thanks. The last one in global partnerships is Urban Infrastructure Insurance Facility, which is the one that I would like to introduce to you now. Next slide, please. Thank you. And UIIF, which is Urban Infrastructure Insurance Facility, is a relatively new-born project that aims at providing a tailor-made insurance for cities in Latin America and the Caribbean to help close the financing gap for recovery and build back better. And this is particularly important because it was recognized in the latest IPCC report. With this example, I would like to offer insights, challenges, but also opportunities that go beyond the project. This project requires looking at and understanding how countries work and how the state distributes competencies, for example, capacities and resources. While working into profiling the participant cities for the UIIF, it is clear that risk management, for example, risk management competencies vary from country to country. And as a result, levels of vertical coordination also vary. In Mexico, for example, in Mexico as a country, is almost exclusively competence of the federal state. In Ecuador, where I come from, competences move up in different levels in the state as the scale of the catastrophe requires. So there are two different approaches already, and this is important to understand. This is also true when it comes to understanding risk. Information on vulnerable population conditions and distribution in a confined territory is usually found in a national census, mostly conducted by national governments as a first entry point. In the same way, understanding how a hazard might impact a city is usually understood first by a local government as one holder of land use competencies. Experience shows that in both cases, it is necessary to provide external help for better understanding, because these two efforts, especially in developing countries, are not enough. And this was already said in the first section of this workshop. However, the UIIF project foresees this. Finally, when it comes to designing an insurance product, usually insurance markets are highly regulated by central and federal governments. So as you can see, a systems thinking approach is needed when designing and implementing risk transfer strategies to navigate and reach to different actors through different political and geographical scales. ICLEI supports cities in acquiring this understanding in order to design the best insurance possible for them. Next slide, please. However, the UIIF project has specific aims and metrics. It is about infrastructure, but also mainly about people. In the same fashion, and this was extensively discussed in the previous sections, when a catastrophe strikes and help needs to be deployed, vertical and horizontal coordination is needed. However, in my experience in developing countries where unplanned and informal settlements occur, connections and coordination with local community or neighborhood leaders is highly desirable. Informality is also related to unregistered information about economic activities that still happen, like housing construction or food distribution or mobility. In these scenarios, it is these leaders that are able to help point out where the most needed are. Since one of the objectives of the UIIF project is to support vulnerable populations socially and economically, then for making sure that this is achieved, these connections are crucial. Participatory programs to build and manage cities with, for, and by people are to be encouraged in cities then is of highly need. All of these under cultural lenses, which is a must. Otherwise, we risk not reaching who needs the most. And I think the COVID coronavirus pandemic really showcased that. And as we move forward into designing and implementing the project, we encourage cities to take into account these aspects and to look at them with a broader scope to really aim at risk management as a greater goal. Next slide and final, please. So here at ICLEI, we are happy to connect and continue these important conversations. Thank you very much.
The perfect time. Thank you so much, David. I'm very impressed. We'll come back to you shortly with any questions. So just to conclude this session, we would like to hear now from our discussant, Isabel Chartry. Isabel is head of the Decentralization, Subnational Finance and Infrastructure Unit at CFE here at the OECD. So Isabel, we would welcome your reflections.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and many thanks for this invitation and the opportunity to provide some feedback on these excellent presentations. I would like to underline two main points that emerge from this presentation. First, it is crucial to having a robust enabling environment for mobilizing subnational climate finance, but also for incentivizing subnational climate action. Concretely, what do we mean by an enabling environment? It is an environment that facilitates the mobilization of additional public and private sources of finance, but also an environment that helps government to make better use of existing sources of funding, including on-source revenues and grants from higher levels of government. This is aligned with the OECD messages on subnational finance in general. That is to say that climate finance is connected to subnational finance and fiscal decentralization frameworks in general. My second remark is the confirmation that networks of cities and regions, such as ICLEI, have a very important role to play in strengthening the multi-level governance of climate action. The ability to convene and gather the opinions of a broad set of subnational governments provides valuable insights into local climate challenges and solutions, that this was presented with this innovative insurance fund. They're also useful to advocate for the subnational governments at national scale, but also international scales, as it was underlined by Eugenie. And finally, association networks represent essential knowledge building and best practice sharing platforms. In the work we are doing on subnational climate finance at the OECD, this network played a key role in capacity building, in leading working groups, and in engaging with us on how to best disseminate the tools and resources we developed. So I will very quickly present this work. And to start, there is no need to repeat why regions and cities play an important role in addressing climate change. And as already mentioned, some national climate policies are strongly interrelated, interconnected with those of higher levels of government, as they shared competencies in many areas. So governing effectively these policies across levels of government is crucial to reach green objectives. Thanks to the work we did, we now have new data that confirm the strong involvement of regions and cities. The data we have come from a joint project with the DG Regio of the European Commission on tracking and measuring subnational climate finance. And we launched the output of this project 2 weeks ago, and they are available on the new subnational government finance hub. And we developed, to track this subnational finance, we developed a pilot methodology to on measuring expenditure, and we used national accounts. And this work confirmed that some national governments are key public spenders and key investors for climate action. So Sujin already mentioned in introduction some figure, but I would like to repeat them, because our results shows that in 2019, some national government accounted for 63% of total climate significant public expenditure and 69% of total climate significant public investment, on average in 33 OECD and EU countries. Our work also shows that the level of climate-related expenditure and investment remains quite small. It represents only 1.1% of GDP for expenditure. And this is more worrying, as it confirms that there is a lack of funding and financing for climate action in regions and cities. And it is also confirmed that the work we did on the revenue tracking, and we developed a compendium of financial instruments for subnational climate action to identify in each OECD and EU country some of the financial support, financial instruments provided to some national governments by a higher level of governments, such as climate funds, guarantees, bonds that are directed at mitigation, but also at adaptation action. So this information can be used to nourish dialogue between levels of government and also with the key stakeholders, such as citizens, businesses, communities. It can help also to discuss on funding gaps for climate objectives, on how also to align revenue sources with these objectives, and how to diversify revenue source, and also how to better coordinate. It was raised by Tenil in her intervention, or to coordinate funds, for example. So last important tool we developed, it is on some national green budgeting, and we wanted to, with this work, to go more granular and to focus on developing some national green budgeting tools. This approach presents several opportunities for some national government because it helps them mainstream climate consideration throughout the budgetary decision-making process for mitigation and adaptation. This contributes to improving also the coordination and effectiveness of climate action. Second, green budgeting helps some national government to prioritize low carbon and climate resilient investment. And finally, it is also an accountability and transparency tool, which can foster, again, closer cooperation and coordination with external stakeholders. Because green budgeting is a tool used by national and some national government, there is a need to coordinate these approaches between levels of government and to promote collaborative approach. So again, this can be part of the broader dialogue on the coordination of climate policy between the levels of government. So I will end now. The OECD has developed guidelines, resources, and a self-assessment tool to help some national government of all sizes and all types to develop their own green budgeting practice. So many thanks again for this session and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So look, we have about 5 minutes for 1 or 2 quick questions. I'm going to use the moderator's discretion just to pose a couple of questions. One in particular, the first of which I'd like to really pose to David, but would invite other panelists to respond to. It's the question of informality. David, you've spoken about this previously, but of course in urban centres you have substantial informal economic centres and you know, socio-cultural community groups that aren't always necessarily visible within formal structures of governance and engagement. And so my question to you would be, you know, as policy and practitioners, how can we better identify these groups, and what sorts of tools and approaches you know, have you used or would you be recommending to engage, to more effectively coordinate and engage with informal sectors?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a great question. And one of the points that I was making in my presentation is that participatory processes and effectively going on the ground and designing with these communities is of high importance. And I'm going to go a little bit off the script, and I'm going to take my head off my head from ICLEI right now, and I'm going to put back for just a couple of minutes my head of CRO in Quito, or former CRO in Quito. And the thing is, we had a pretty comprehensive participation program in the city, basically to develop urban plans with communities. And it was a very interesting exercise. But what is really interesting there is that when the pandemic hit, the municipality didn't know exactly where the most needed were, and they were able to reach these neighborhood leaders, which were the ones that we were working with to develop these agendas, and they became kind of like partners of the city's response when food was needed, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that participatory policies need to empower, like Lina said, but also to create these connections and to create these sort of, let's say, partnerships. And I'm going to stop there Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And so then just one last question, and I'll put this to both Tenniel and Professor Birch. You know, as sort of urbanization, concentration in urban centres is increasing and climate risks at the same time are augmenting, the role of cities is really coming front and centre. I wonder if for you, working in this space, if you see a change in terms of the way we need to be coordinating and engaging as a result of the ascent of cities and municipal areas. Is it changing kind of the paradigm of governance, if you like? So maybe I'll look to Professor Birch first, and then Tenniel, if you'd like to have a final word. You're muted, Professor Birch.
I'd also like to address that last question as well, because it has to do with the presence of cities in the global discussions. With regard to informality, the ILO and the World Bank collect data on informality on the economic sector. And so we have an understanding of what the jobs are and what's happening. Most recently, a report on the long shadow of informality came out of the World Bank. And then you have Slum Dwellers, Shack Dwellers International, which is dealing with collecting information and inventorying the settlement spaces. So I think that informality within the discussion of cities is obviously coming to the fore. Now, with regard to cities coming to the fore, let's just look what happened in the United Nations recently. The Secretary General created an advisory committee or task force on subnational governments, and in his annual report called Our Common Agenda made reference to the fact that subnational governments are really important, and has recommended to the General Assembly to create a advisory committee with mayors and member states in the UN. Now, why is this important? Because there's been such a fight in the United Nations about recognizing the voices of local governments, that the fact that you have the Secretary General recognizing this, some agreement maybe on the part of the General Assembly saying, yes, this is great. We may see some movement in this arena. In the US government, for example, there is now a bill in Congress to create a subnational unit in our Department of State. Unheard of. Let's hope it gets through, that there would be some sort of discussion at that level. And we're seeing that in other places, the recognition administratively, structurally, within these institutions that they need to think about cities. And the last point I would make is about the G7 and its declaration, the fact that it included cities in the declaration, and it's going to have a ministerial meeting of urban development ministers, and included as a participant, not an observer, is the mayor of Manhattan as an active participant. So I think these are all indications that there is a growing recognition of the importance of cities. Are we there yet? No. Are we getting there? Thanks to the networks, thanks to groups like OECD and the research and data that you're putting forward. Thanks to ICLEI for what it's doing for COP27 at WOOF. It created a lobbying group to support the city's activities at COP27. There's a lot happening. So I'm quite optimistic, but we've got a lot more to do.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Professor Birch. Tenniel?
I would actually agree with Professor Birch in terms of there are certainly jurisdictions, cities that have made their experience being alumni of catastrophic disasters has propelled them to the forefront of, we can speak on these issues, we can provide best practices because we've lived it. And for that reason, their credibility has skyrocketed. It's not that they lacked it before, but when you have had major disasters occur in your community, when you've had multiple experiences with extreme heat and trying to ensure that your health networks and your most vulnerable populations are taken care of, you have something to offer the rest of the world. What I would expect to see next is that those municipalities, those cities, that they then become if you will, consortia of their own, that you start to see the drivers, that they're leading the academic conferences, that they're leading the best practices opportunities, and they're sharing that in a format that's more than just, I happen to be colleagues with the leadership of this particular jurisdiction. There is just such a wealth of untapped information and data. My favorite is something that was mentioned earlier, just the creation of chief resilience officers and designation in cities and municipalities for someone who is there to coordinate with emergency management, social services, working with NGOs and community-based organizations so that vulnerable populations and those who have been informally engaged or lack of engagement in the past can have those needs brought forward as they're trying to tackle climate solutions. That's where I see the trends going in urban communities.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm assuming you can hear me. Look, thank you for those final words. Fantastically rich. There's a huge conversation to be had here, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you all. Just to conclude today's session, we do have a hard stop, but we want to offer the opportunity for Andrew Pragg, Senior Advisor here at the OECD Environment Directorate. He is responsible to coordinate and lead the OECD's major cross-directorate initiative on integrating climate and economic resilience. So Andrew Pragg, closing remarks, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to everyone, to my colleagues and to all the excellent speakers today. That was a really fascinating session of remarkably high quality and in an amazingly quick time. In less than 3 hours, we dealt with a huge number of subjects at really quite some depth from so many different perspectives, and all the speakers keeping to time. So thank you all for such a great session. And I'm not a cities person by expertise. I've worked a lot in climate policy, environment policy, energy policy. So really learn a huge amount from these kind of sessions. So thank you. And as Catherine said, part of my role is to coordinate what we call this horizontal project at the OECD that Tadashi introduced briefly at the beginning of the session today, which is really a major cross-cutting initiative bringing in all parts of the OECD. As Tadashi said, one of its goals is to draw on the wide reach that we enjoy here at the OECD with all our different departments, our different people with different expertise, and our different reach into so many different policy communities to see where we can add value that draws on that very multidisciplinary approach, because climate change is now recognized as such a cross-cutting issue, one that requires such a transformation across society, that it's about all sectors and all parts of government, and indeed all levels of government, including, very importantly, of course, cities. So for me, this kind of event really shows how that can happen in practice. It's one of those things that's nice to say and get senior managers talking about how we're holistic and multidisciplinary and things, but this kind of event really get into seeing how that really works in practice and where we can learn from this expertise, in particular at the city level. So again, thanks for that. That was the first thing I wanted to say. Second thing is as Tadashi also said, one of the goals of this project is to look at how we can bring forward better advice to our governments on more systemic and systems level approaches to tackling the climate change question, both in terms of transition to net zero and in terms of building systemic resilience, as we've been talking about today. Now, this sort of systems approaches thing is another of these areas where it's easy to throw out the word and it's a bit buzzwordy and a bit jargony and can be hard to understand what people mean in practice. So again, this event today really helped me to understand, when you're looking at from the city's perspectives, well, what are we talking about here? What are the systems we actually mean? What are the systemic risks that we see from climate change related to those systems, and what are the kind of systems level of solutions and approaches to improve that systemic resilience? So it really helped me to understand better how to approach that from the city's level. One of the things I took away was that you have to recognize if we're talking about systems approaches in cities, then it goes beyond the city itself, and we really have to think about the key systems, the food systems, the energy systems, things which come from outside of the city boundary, and the impact of climate shocks on those systems and what that means for city populations. Inside this project, actually, we have separate initiatives underway looking, for example, at food system resilience, from kind of farm right through to fork and food waste. So I'm going to now look at more how we can link those two things together from the cities and the food side. That's just one example. Also on the energy system side, we heard about the Texas freeze today. We have a separate initiative underway also under this project, looking at what were the kind of system failure points in the Texas energy system and electricity market that led to those failures, and what can be more done on resilience for that. So again, great links we can make to pulling out from today's session. I also took away, when you do look within the city limits, of course, there are many critical systems that you can be looking at, but that if we're talking about transformative adaptation, then it goes beyond just responding to shocks. It's about addressing the underlying inequalities, addressing sustainable livelihoods, making sure basic services are provided as a prerequisite to any kind of genuine, durable, sustainable resilience over the long term. And that fits very well with our wider themes around the just transition, so-called just transition, making sure that climate change transition to net zero is something which is really not increasing inequalities, but helping to reduce them. And that's also essential for making sure that that transition is resilient and durable. So I took that away as well. I also like the emphasis early on about that there are opportunities here as well, particularly in the sense of what urbanization can do to improve overall resilience to climate change, and particularly in fast-growing cities in the developing world where much of the infrastructure is still to be built. And climate change can sometimes seem quite a negative topic. It's all about impacts and damages and so on, whereas that like that emphasis on, well, there's actually big opportunities here when you look at the cities as a system and what the opportunities are from better urbanization that takes into account the changing climate and the chronic and acute shocks that we will be seeing. And then lastly, of course, all the points made in the last session then on governance challenges, the both upscaling from cities to national governments and the downscaling from national to the city level. So much learnings to take away from that, and glad to hear positive sides there about progress being made, about better recognition of cities. Certainly those of us working with the UN climate change negotiations over many years have noticed that big growing role for cities as part of the non-state actors group, and it's good to hear from that there. So those are my few key takeaways. Really looking forward to the report that Tadashi and colleagues will be pulling together and that we'll be contributing to, and we'll be making sure that features very strongly in this broad horizontal project that I've been talking about. So thank you to everyone again. And I just close with one thing that Mark Pelling said earlier on. I think he said, talking about adaptation, we're rich in plans but poor in implementation. I thought that was great, because that really speaks for the whole climate world. I think it's certainly on the net zero side as well. It's there's no shortage of plans, but some shortage in implementation, and it's up to all of us now to really get there, helping support our governments at the national level, at the city level, to get on with that implementation. Thank you again to colleagues and to all the speakers, and for giving me the opportunity to come in today at the end of the session. I think now I'll hand back to Tadashi to close the meeting. Is that right?
Exactly. Thank you very much, Andrew, and great summary. I'm not gonna make any second conclusion, but I just wanted to say thank you to all. Shocks and the system's climate risks are very complex, multidimensional, compounded. But one takeaway I would still say is that those are really all connected at the local communities and cities. So I was also struck by Roma's statement saying that recognizing citizens is most essential things, and to start, to build resilience in cities, and then also engaging all stakeholders, all actors is of course essential. It's said many times, but it was really reassured that this is a starting point and all the connecting point for this resilience work. So thank you very much again for all the participants, all the people, audience who are listening to us for about 3 hours long without actually a break. All the panelists, thank you very much for your accepting invitation from us. Next steps, yes, so we are first of all digesting all the information that we received today, and incorporating them with our original work that we have been doing, and advance our paper. So we are very much happy to continue our dialogues, exchanges, and of views with you. And hopefully we can also receiving further inputs to our work, so that we can improve our paper to be launched at COP27. We also like to create further collaborative actions with all of you to work together to advance our climate agenda. So let's keep in touch. Thank you again. And I hope we are giving back 2 minutes to you. This is extraordinary. Thank you very much for all the staff who are preparing for this event. particularly Tara Jansen, who managed this excellently from the beginning to the end, and also Matteo Ledesma, who is always with me, helping me organizing this session, and all the other staff who are working together with us for this event. So thank you very much for your efforts. So thank you again. Goodbye, and then I hope we are all having a great summer. Thank you. Bye-bye.